Chapter 14 of Across the Andes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by James T. Oligny. Across the Andes by Charles Johnson Post. Drifting down the Rio Mapiri. That night we made camp on a sandbar in one of the more open reaches of water and close to the river's edge. With their short machetes the Lecos cut some canes, unlashed our tentage from the platforms, and rigged a rough shelter. In the balmy air of the sunset there was no indication that it was needed, but during this season a tropical rain comes up with the suddenness of a breeze, and pitching a tent in a driving downpour in the darkness of perdition is no light pleasure. For themselves, the Lecos simply threw a matting of woven palm leaves on the sand and their camp was made. The bank was lined with a fringe of driftwood, and Spanish cedar and mahogany made admirable fuel, and gave one at the same time a sense of wanton, extravagant luxury that the humbler cooking fires of our north never obtain. Presently little fires crackled into life along the playa, while gathering around each were groups of Lecos in their loose, flapping square shirts, or else stripped to the waist in the hot evening air, intent on the small pots of boiling rice, platanos, and chelona. Quickly the velvet darkness of the tropics fell, and the high lights flickered on naked skins. Slowly the moon rose above the purple hills of the background, transforming the muddy surface of the swirling river into a shimmer of molten silver. The smooth sandy playa softened in the mellow light, while, in the foreground, the campfires threw in strong relief the easy play of naked muscles in the shifting groups of savage figures. Beyond were other figures, silhouetted against the night or merged with the bulk of the Kayapos, gently swaying at the river's edge to the low roar of the current. The subdued chatter of the Lecos, the crackling of the driftwood flames, the occasional cry of some morose tropical bird of the night, and once in a while the far-off snarling howl of a jaguar in the hills beyond, blended like the carefully studied tones of some painting, and the peace that passeth the understanding of cities descended. The very pleasing moon also added to the enthusiasm of the sand fleas and sand hoppers, diabolical out of all proportion to their physical capacity, and by the aid of the fourth dimension triumphing over my netting, they made of sleep a periodic and exhausting labor. I looked out and envied the impervious Lecos. Half naked to the night they sprawled on their patches of palm matting, and only awakened in response to an itching thirst, and then prowled round to locate the extra ration. Somewhere back in the hills were the savages, the Chunchos and the Yungus, but they rarely come down to this river. It is too populous according to their standards, and precautions against them are rarely needed. Farther on, when we got into the Rio Cauca and the Rio Beni, some care was essential, and it was necessary to camp on the largest sandbars and close to the water's edge, where the camp could not be rushed in a sudden dash from the jungle. The next morning, with the first faint trickle of dawn along the rim of purple hills, the camp was astir. A single fire was stirred into activity, and in the dim gray light there was a hasty cup of tea and a raw platano, and again we waded aboard the Kayapo and swung out into the current. The cool gray-green of the early morning had faded to a delicate sapphire. The purple hills loomed nearer in the soft haze. Above them shimmering waves of amethyst overspread half the skies. A faint glow as of soft coral flickered over the crests of a stray cloud that, close after, flushed with the bolder brilliancy of the ruby and the topaz. There was no pause. One color after another, exquisite in its gorgeousness or delicacy, as though from the slowly opening door of a prismatic furnace. Crimson, violet, deep-sea blues, and old gold shifted and coiled above the purple hills. A thread of silver tipped their crests, and then, at their center, there was for an instant the gleam of molten gold, and a second more above the low morning mist there floated the glowing mass of the sun. The day had begun. For hours we drifted down the swift current. Now and then a snake or perhaps an otter glided silently into the eddies as we drifted by. We seemed to move with an intolerable slowness, and yet when we watched the jungle on each side slipping by we could see the speed, 6, 8, and sometimes 10 miles an hour. The sun rose higher. It beat down on the unsheltered Kayapo like the hot blast from a furnace. The animal sounds in the forests ceased. The faint morning airs died away, and nothing broke the stillness but the occasional shrill flocks of parrots. The muddy surface of the river turned to a heated, brazen glare, and the long breakfastless hours of the forenoon crawled past. Presently, as we swung around a bend, there appeared a tiny cane-walled hut surrounded by a few platano and yucca trees. Splashing in the river were naked little babies, and as our lecos set up a shout, a woman trotted to the bank and waved back. We paddled out of the current and made a landing, while the young leco who had run the river on the bundle of sticks took on a sack of clean clothes. The lecos are very particular in these matters. Each morning, from out their home-woven cotton sacks, they would don clean trousers and shirt, and at every opportunity going up or down the river, they would stop and turn over to the leco wife the soiled ones and take aboard a clean supply. When a trip is too long for a complete outfit, they would get busy at each midday breakfast and wash their own. The sack they carried would hold about as much as a small keg, and it was always crowded to its capacity with their queer square shirts and tight-ankled trousers. Their only other baggage was a plate, a spoon, and a tiny kettle for rice. Clean clothes every day is a peculiar hobby for a primitive tribe. This leco woman, or rather girl, who trotted down to the water's edge was about 16, wore only a single long garment, a chula, that came to above the ankles and had no sleeves. Some forest flower was in her black hair, and she was a beauty. Not by any of the savage standards alone, or by the easy imagination that gives some youthful savages a certain attractiveness as a matter of pure contrast, but she was beautiful by any of those standards that obtain in our home countries. Along with her regular features, delicate nostrils, soft eyes, and regular curving lips, with a soft, light coppery, tawny complexion, so soft and light that the color came and went in her cheeks like a fresh-blown debutante, she had the carriage of a queen, though that was nothing to a race of women who carry burdens on their heads from babyhood, and who can swim like otters. I saw later very many leco women, and while all were superior in type to those of the neighboring tribes, there was but one that could compare with the features of this first leco girl, and the two might have been sisters, so close was the type of their beauty. More leco homes appeared, and at each some one of the crew received his new stock of clean clothes and packed his pouch with them. Then Guanai appeared, or rather, we stopped under the river bank close by, for the straggling collection of huts lies some distance back from the river. A few rubber traders, half-breeds and cholos live here and control the lecos. Most of them, when I was there, were refugees from the other side of the Andes, and here are beyond the reach of the Bolivian authorities. Once in a while, some one of them is caught and taken out in chains by the soldiers sent in for the special purpose, but as a rule, that followed only as the result of internecine difficulty and resulting treachery. The headman came down to the bank to meet us with his neck stiff and awkward in some homemade bandage. He was still half drunk, but very hospitable. The night before, it seems, there had been a fight, and when the candles were stamped out in the little hut it became very confusing, he explained, hence the stab in the neck, and somewhere a couple of men were nursing bullet holes. We handed over the few letters from the cholo at Mapiri, and he was eager to get news of La Paz and the outside world. For years he had lived here, a refugee from the law and unmolested. Some day he will meet with as sudden a death as he had often bestowed, and another headman will fill his uncertain shoes. A torn straw hat, cotton shirt, and leco trousers were his sole costume, and he hunts barefoot and runs the river as readily as any of the Lecco tribesmen. Below Guanay, the Rio Mapiri is reinforced by the Rio Coroico and the Rio Tipuani, clear, cold streams. All along, little brooks and mountain torrents have also been adding to the volumes of our river, so that it had grown to a goodly size. Below this settlement of Guanay were the worst and most dangerous passages. Any of the rapids are bad, but they are less to be feared than the great whirlpools that form below each one of them. It is these remolinos that are more likely to catch the rafts and tear them apart. The rough water of the rapid can be watched, and the Queyapo can be kept head-on in the current, but below there are no means of judging when a whirling vortex will form that will drag the Queyapo under and perhaps later throw it out farther down in scattered fragments. For 50 miles the hills crowded in, and there were only rarely any open, slower reaches of river. Huge masses of rock had broken from above and hurled themselves into the gorges, where the current was choked in masses of high-flung spray. The Leccos know that on one certain side of these rocks there was disaster, and with their heavy paddles they pried the raft in the proper currents. At first the water was smooth, smoother than in the broader reaches, but the banks moved past more swiftly, and from out of the water itself came a little rattling, crackling sound, the sound of boulders on the riverbed crashing together as they were swept downstream. Then the surface of the river broke up in snapping little ripples, while under our feet there was the feel of the raft straining in the eddying thrust of the current. But it is these parts of the river that the Leccos fairly love. Their eyes sparkled and they laughed and chattered with excitement. Ahead there was a roaring smother of foam, which curled back in a crested wave. The paddles, with the Queyapo snouts as a fulcrum, swung the course to the right, and a second later there came a rush and a crash as a mass of boiling water climbed over the starboard cargo, and we careened until the crew on the lower side were breast deep in the smother. It was only for a second, and the raft drifted out among the eddying whirlpools that formed below. One, a fairly small one, caught us at the stern, and we were drawn under as if caught by a submarine claw. The waters rose to the breasts of the stern crew while they, braced against their paddles, grinned back at us cheerfully. Then the vortex broke, and very slowly the cargo rose, dripping into view. Every rapid, bend, or cataract in this part has its name, and Honor denied the distances up the Mapiri of the day before. We passed the Conseli and entered Kirkana, the spelling is phonetic, a magnified mountain brook that boiled through the tortuous passages for miles. There was not a mile that did not have its channel choked with rock, through which we shot in a smother of foam like a South Sea islander on his surfboard. Then came a canyon with walls of gray rock on which were stains or symbols that in a rough way suggested some of the old Inca forms, to which the Leccos have given the name of Devil-Painted Rapids. Beyond lie the rapids of the Bad Waters, and then the Isipuri Rapids, where there was a large rubber baraka in charge of an English superintendent. The night's camp was at Isipuri, a rubber baraka that was complaining bitterly at the time that it was overstocked with marmalade and snakes. If you have never lived on marmalade for 6 months hand running when transportation is practically cut off, and a cheap tin can marmalade made mainly for the calloused tongues of a half-breed trade at that, you do not know what real desolation in a rubber jungle is. Also, it was the hatching season for snakes, and there was never a day, even scarcely an hour, when a few feet or less of snake was not being untangled from the cane-walled thatch of the house. 2 were fished out of the kettles in the cook shack as the Lecco lady cook started to prepare the midday breakfast, and even the ordinary security of a hammock was no guarantee against them. Rarely were they big. Some were mere babies and others but adolescent boas. One of 8 feet in length was killed, but this was an exception. For the general run were juveniles of from a few inches to 2 or 3 feet. Also, 8 feet was not a big snake, not in a country where you can hear tales of 30 and 40-foot reptiles. The chief in this barraca was a white man. He had a well-kept place with its outbuildings and little Indian quarters laid out with some system. There was sweet corn, real sweet corn, and not the choclo of the Aymara, an unripe ear of common field corn, melons, yuccas, bananas, and the best attempt at a garden that could be made in a tropical jungle. Also, before dinner that evening a Lecco boy came in with a log of wood which he dumped in the cookhouse. With a machete he chopped it up, for firewood as I thought. Presently at dinner there was a most delicious vegetable, hot, and looking like coldslaw or sauerkraut. It was my old friend the log of wood, the bud of the cabbage palm chopped by a rubber picker somewhere out in the forest. End of chapter 14.